Now, it's the CKNW and Global News Neighborhood Series for GNF Financial Group, Life Beyond Banking.
Thanks for joining us this morning on this edition of the Neighborhood Series. We have invited Aaron Chapman back to the studio. He's a Vancouver writer and historian and has written several books on Vancouver history, one of which won the 2015 BC Book Prize. Good morning. Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you again, John. Good morning.
We're going to talk about Commercial Drive.
Yes, the Commercial Drive sort of Grandview area. East Van is a big location, but to sort of focus maybe on Commercial Drive, Grandview, yeah.
All right. Well, let's. How far back do you want to go?
Well, it's interesting to see how Commercial Drive has changed in recent years, maybe. But there's an interesting story about sort of the genesis of that neighborhood. Of course, Vancouver started more really actually in the very location we are here at CKNW Studios, right? And in this area next to the Hotel Vancouver and whatnot, was sort of the second sort of outgrowing of Vancouver from the Gastown area.
Right.
So out in East Vancouver, it wasn't really until 1912 that Commercial Drive and that area began to sort of come together as a distinct neighborhood, maybe that was separate from the downtown area, and that would have been a distance from back then to travel to go out to that area of town. So there was a gentleman by the name of E.J. Clark in 1889. He was a dry goods baron, and he had made his money in that industry, and then, like all Vancouverites over the history of the city who have made their millions, did it off real estate. He bought real estate. And he bought a number of plots of land in around Commercial Drive, what was then called Park Drive. And in particular, donated an area of land which we now call Clark Park, which up right about 14th and Commercial there. And if you read just the sort of the glossed over or the newspaper report of the day about this donation, it seems like this is a well-meaning businessman who's done well in the city and is giving back to his community. In fact, he was a pretty shrewd guy. He was giving it away to make more money because in the surrounding land that he owned that that was surveyed for residential purposes, he was thinking that if there was a real sort of premier park space there, that the land around would be much more valuable to sell off then for homes and whatnot. So he made a deal with the city to donate this land, and the city had to clear some of the stumps and bracken and whatnot that were there. It was forested, but it was still a little uneven. It had to be plowed. But the city didn't do anything with it. It wasn't until 1904. In fact, the Parks Board at the time had to remind the city that they owned this piece of land. They had simply ignored it. And Clark and his family were quite upset that the city hadn't really done anything with it. They'd given this land in good faith, hoped to develop a new part of town that was in that area, and they hadn't done so. So they took the city to court, all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, to get the land back, saying that the city had reneged on the deal.
Wow.
And they lost the trial. But around 1907, the city finally sort of stepped in and started to sort of clear things. And the land that had been, the surrounding land, which had been sold over time back and forth to many different people had sort of ignored the fine print in the deal that Clark had put in there. As it turns out, he had surveyed the land for blocks and streets and whatnot. But surrounding each block in that area of Commercial Drive, he had kept a 1-foot space around each block. So he owned a grid work. And when the city, when developers came in for water permits to tie the water permit, the and sewer lines to the houses,
right,
they were notified that they were trespassing on Clark's property, and everybody had to pay $15 to get. Clark wouldn't sell. He said you had to pay me to get this land back if you really wanted. So he made a further bit of money from this 1-foot space that was around the whole. And this was such a fracas in the news in the city at the time that the news of this Vancouver real estate deal in East Floyd was reached all the way to Montreal. It was printed in the Montreal Gazette.
Wow.
Of wacky Vancouver real estate.
Some things never change.
Some things never change, exactly. Yeah.
Tell me about Commercial. When I first came to Vancouver in early 1970s, Commercial Drive was the Little Italy. It was very much Italian coffee houses and bakeries and what have you. And it stayed that way for quite a few years, but then started to change.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how that neighborhood has changed. You're very right in saying that was sort of considered the Little Italy part of town. In many ways, it's still considered that. People still talk to it about that, especially if you're an older sort of person in Vancouver. You'll still consider it that. And there's certainly Italian restaurants there. Mm-hmm. In fact, the post office is on Commercial Drive is called the Little Italy Post Office still. And if you go to some of the ATM machines for instance, the Van City there at the corner of First and Commercial, you can do your banking in Italian, and you can choose Italian or English or French. So I like to choose Italian and then sort of think of the Godfather theme song as I'm taking out my $20 from the ATM. But the neighborhood began to change. Sort of, it was very much that Little Italy thing, as you say, up until it began to change in the 1970s. Mm-hmm. Certainly with Asian immigration to Vancouver, as well as even some immigration from Latin America. The neighborhood began to change there in the sense that you started seeing different other kinds of businesses sort of occupying that space. But, so often when we think of neighborhoods, when we think of a neighborhood, we're thinking of a residential sort of area or Shaughnessy or a Dunbar or Southlands in terms of simply where people live. But Commercial Drive, of course, has that. There's a main street there with businesses, and it's both that sort of business and residential thing that sort of makes it distinct, as well as the fact that, outside of a couple of stores, it's all independent business stores. It's not chains. Somehow Commercial Drive has managed to resist that, or it's still very much sort of family businesses or an independent store. So it's an interesting neighborhood that way.
There was a time when Commercial Drive and the Grandview area was there was a plan to run a freeway through it.
Yes.
We'll talk with Aaron Chapman more about that when we come back. It is the Neighborhood Series here on CKNW, the stuff you never knew about. Commercial Drive. Aaron Chapman, writer and historian, with us this morning here on CKNW. Much more coming up.
Certainly.
The Neighborhood Series on CKNW. Aaron Chapman is here, a Vancouver writer and historian. We're talking about Commercial Drive and the history of. There was a real seminal occurrence, I think, in the late 60s, early 70s, when there was a plan to build a freeway from Highway 1, essentially, into downtown. The Georgia and Dunsmuir viaducts that we still have are the first part of that. And that was eventually, the idea was shot down because the community got together and said, no, we don't want a freeway through here. And lo and behold, they stopped it.
Exactly. In fact, it was many communities, because it wasn't just the folks along Commercial Drive. It was certainly Chinatown.
Sure. Yeah.
And a number of different sort of people along the way through Strathcona and whatnot, that had that, that fought that fight and surprisingly won. It's interesting and it's interesting, of course, now that we're talking about bringing down the viaducts.
Yes.
46 years later from their inception.
Yeah.
To get rid of that. Yeah, it had that. It's interesting to think about had that freeway system continued. Vancouver would probably have ended up looking much like Seattle, where you have freeways right into the heart of the city like that. And we don't have that. And that has forever sort of altered the way downtown, eventually would become. So.
Yeah, but if you stood back and said, here's how we're going to lay out a modern 21st century city, you would look at Vancouver and cringe, because you've got the downtown core essentially sitting on, well, it's not quite a peninsula, but almost.
Yeah.
And a massive park on the end of it, and then a 3-lane bridge connecting that. And the freeway, in quotes, is like, I don't know how many kilometers and how many minutes to the east.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
You certainly wouldn't lay this place out.
Not at all.
The way it's ended up. And
you can't necessarily fault the thinking that back in the 1960s, where there was that idea that let's get some freeways right in the city, because this is the way we move people around. There was no concept of some of the urban planning ideas that there are today, of course. It's a night and day difference. And not only that, and what doesn't get talked about, and we were just talking about, was the idea that there was very little in the way of sort of heritage preservation in Vancouver in the 60s and 70s. In fact, on the heels of the moon landing and the space age world, I can remember even the attitude well into the 1970s as a kid. There was let's get a modern city. To hell with these old buildings, dusty old places.
Tear it down.
Tear it down. Let's put a modern sort of space age building for something for the future and things like this. That was the attitude back then. So there was very much that concept that certainly an older area town like Strathcona or Chinatown, which was maybe considered sort of downtrodden even back then. To people, it was, people said, no, let's get a freeway through here. So it's interesting, as I say, it forever changed the way that the downtown and the surrounding neighborhoods, not just Commercial Drive, were developed.
Commercial Drive, the neighborhood I think, is just a tremendous. I've never lived there. Would be a tremendous place to live. It's just in these days with the shopping and everything that's there, and I can see why people would be highly protective of it. Yeah,
I've lived there in a couple different areas over the years here living in Vancouver, and it's such a high sort of density residential area as well. If you've lived here in Vancouver, you've grown up here born and raised here like I did. If I would go to the store, I would bump into about 15 people I knew, and it would take about an hour to come there and come back because you see a lot of people along that strip too. It's interesting as well to think about how the neighborhood has changed. There's this attitude that the consideration that Commercial Drive was today. It's think of as sort of a home where sort of arty people live, or people who work in web design or film or the arts or media and whatnot. That wasn't the case back in the Little Italy days of it. In fact, Kitsilano might have been more considered the home of where, the students and whatnot would have lived. So Commercial Drive has changed greatly over the years. And if you look at the arc of history over that, it's sort of almost night and day that way, the way that the neighborhoods make it. There's still some of the old residents and whatnot, still there's that, but it's a completely new thing. And when we talk about East Vancouver, and East Vancouver sort of being a tough, working class neighborhood. Well, as I said to you before, there's $1 million homes in East Van just like there are in Kerrisdale.
Absolutely.
So even Commercial Drive in East Van has changed a lot as well as other neighborhoods have in the city.
Yeah. You mentioned Chinatown, and there's been a big debate recently about changing the face of Chinatown development, building up, and there's been a fair amount of pushback by some people, by some neighborhood activists, and to me, that's one of the real tricky parts of this whole thing to try to solve, quote unquote, Vancouver's housing crisis, is that you're always going to have that pushback. The people don't want their neighborhoods to change. They don't want the history to go away. They want to keep
exactly.
And so it's almost like whatever neighborhood you go to, there's going to be, and it's not, you can call it NIMBYism, but I think it's more than that. I think people, are truly and well concerned about what their neighborhoods are going to look like.
I think so. Yeah, Chinatown is an interesting example that way in terms of. Some of it, I think, sometimes comes down to, the design. I think everybody realizes that neighborhoods are going to change. And, Chinatown at this point is probably in need of a lifeline of some development and some new things coming in. In fact, you certainly see that to walk around Chinatown. There's lots of sort of new independent businesses. Not all of them, of course, Asian or Asian Canadians that are opening them. Because it's probably a cheaper area to start a store than in Yaletown would be, I imagine, if you're just starting out. But in terms of some of the residential buildings that are started to come online, around Kiefer and Maine and whatnot, my sort of criticism is that they don't necessarily look. That building could look like it could be in False Creek or Yaletown or any one of the new condominium, Cole Harbor. And I think some architects need to make some design adaptations to discover what really fits and what sort of blends in visually with that community to keep it. So it's another interesting situation going on.
Aaron, great to see you again.
You too.
Thanks for coming in. We always appreciate it.
Thank you.
Aaron Chapman is a Vancouver writer and historian and has written several books on Vancouver history, one of which won the 2015 BC Book Prize. And he's a resource we're going to draw on a few more times, I think, throughout the Neighbourhood series, if he is amenable to that, because he knows so much about the history of Vancouver and environs. The News 2 9:30 is coming up next.